Hello everybody and welcome back to our lecture series. I'm Ted, your host, and for this lecture we're going to continue along with our examination of African history. We're going to look at, we have already looked at East Africa, we've looked at West Africa, we've looked at Central Africa. We're going to drift down to Southeast Africa. We're going to look at, really going to zero in at the site of Great Zimbabwe. Before we do that, I'd just like to give a sort of little background to Great Zimbabwe. Great Zimbabwe, when the Europeans first visited it, they were amazed by the site. They were amazed by the sophistication of the dry stone architecture. Karl Marx, a German trader, he was the first European to describe the site of Great Zimbabwe, and he wrote his description in 1871. Now, unfortunately, no description of Great Zimbabwe exists from the period of its height during its long life as a major urban center in Southeast Africa. Zimbabwe has been subject to a great degree of mistreatment. Great Zimbabwe was the focal point of regional politics, and it remains the only archaeological site to have a country named after it. When Karl Marx first reported on the site, he misrepresented it, which initiated a long period of damage to the image and the history of Great Zimbabwe. It also led to the actual physical damaging of the archaeological site. As noted earlier, many of the 19th century adventurers were blinded by prejudice, and this prejudice was shared by the colonial elite, as well as the more prominent scientists of the day. As well, and they all refused to believe that a large, sophisticated settlement had been built by Africans. This led to the development of some very fanciful and downright racist tales about mythologies regarding a lost band of Trojans, the lost army of Cambyses II of Persia, the Phoenicians, lost tribes of Israel. The stories point to every major group that we've discussed, with the exception of the local Africans in Southeast Africa themselves. So it's his misrepresentation, along with these racist 19th century assumptions, led to this development of this mythology, this canon of mythology that ascribes the direction and the creation of the state of Great Zimbabwe to every other group except for the local peoples themselves. Now, much of the site known to us, much of the site, and it's really known to us as the Hill Ruin, was defaced and destroyed in a fit of colonial gold lust by pseudo-archaeologists. The damage was wanton and it was destructive. And the destruction largely stems from the gold mining expedition, and it severely impairs our ability to interpret the archaeological site. Now, the myth and the tales of the foreign origins of Great Zimbabwe, they still persist. Down to this very day, there are still those who would argue for a foreign influence for the development of Great Zimbabwe, and there are still books being written and seminars being given, and even video discussions like what I do being given to support that line of thinking, that train of thought on Great Zimbabwe's origin. Now, during the later colonial period, the segregationist government of Rhodesia refused to allow archaeologists to speak or write of the African origins of the site. Due to the hardline opposition from the colonial government, the anti-colonial forces, they gravitated towards Zimbabwe, and the site gained a renewed political importance, which eventually led to the adoption of the name Zimbabwe after the colony Rhodesia's independence from Great Britain. Now, around the year 200, there was a very rapid dispersal of iron-using farming communities from East Africa to South Africa. Now, before that, the site was home to foraging and hunting and gathering communities. The initial group of farmers most likely settled near the eastern coast of Africa before moving inland. Now, the farmers who moved inland, they cultivated the traditional African crops of sorghum and millet. They kept sheep, they kept goats, and they kept cattle. And the cattle, they thrived on the Zimbabwean plateau. The decision to move inland was most likely motivated by the need to protect their herds of cattle from diseases that were common along the coast, like it just evaded me, but it was diseases that quickly killed off cattle and horses. Between 500 and 900, control over an expansion of these cattle herds developed as a central form of wealth in these communities. Now, a way of distinguishing between relationships and access to resources also arose during this period. And cattle, just on the importance of cattle became far more than just a food source for the people. The villages sites. The villages of these herding communities, of these now herding and farming communities, they're larger than their coastal counterparts or the previous coastal settlements that these people had moved from, and this is because of the space required for the herding, for the pasturing of the cattle, and then also for the rise in the numbers of people being supported by their farming and their herding. Now, these communities develop a lithoscarpy tradition, which is culturally descended from the earlier farming communities, with some changes in the ceramic style and larger herding activities. This activity occurs in the Limpopo Valley and on the Zimbabwean plateau at select sites. Now, there are three important developments that occur about the year 1000. One would be an expansion in agriculture. The other would be an expansion in economics, and the other would be the political investments that would now go along with cattle herding. Now, regional trading networks expand, and they extend from the Kalahari Desert in what is now Botswana to the east coast of Africa and north to what is now Zambia. Now, these communities, they also begin to engage in gold mining, and glass trade beads from the Indus River Valley also begin to appear in East Africa during this period. Now, the trade networks tied Southeast Africa together with the then flourishing Indian Ocean trade. This trade was facilitated by Swahili-speaking traders. Cattle becomes a nexus for the social organization of the region. Marriage offers, dowries, compensation for crimes, ancestor worship are all conducted through the use of cattle. And the cattle are also exchanged and sacrificed for the worship of the ancestors. Now, the primary characteristic of herding, particularly of herding cattle and keeping herds and particularly cattle herds as a source of wealth, is that they are a democratic source of wealth. That is because cattle reproduce. You can increase your stock and thus your wealth and your position in society without much outside intervention. You can increase your wealth anywhere that grazing land can be found. On the other hand, access to gold, cowrie shells, glass beads, those are not democratic forms of wealth. Those kinds of goods can only be gained by elite groups, and once elite groups gain access to these goods, they can more easily restrict it to themselves. In the 10th and the 11th centuries, the elites of Southeast Africa emerge, and they base their position on the prestige goods along with traditional goods that they have exclusive control over. Cattle is still kept, has the prestige good. but also trade goods. And these elites, they also gain control over the ivory and the gold trade, extending from their urban centers into the interior of Africa. And these goods, the gold and the ivory, they're used to obtain trade goods that cannot be produced locally, that are not produced locally. This elevates elite sites in the Limpopo Valley. The elites develop greater control over the gold trade, as well as the trade with the what Swahili-speaking peoples along the Indus River Valley, and they go and then they develop trade with local communities further inland, and they relocate themselves. They develop sites all their own, from on hilltops. And from these hilltops, they can peer down at their subjects, at their social inferiors, and sort of overlook them, and sort of ensure that they're doing what the elites need to ensure that the elites have access to these what are now all importing trade goods. The structure and the ideology of the elite group of Great Zimbabwe remains a mystery due to the plundering that I mentioned earlier. Great Zimbabwe appears to be the capital of a large territorial state, roughly the size of modern Zimbabwe, with trading relations extending all the way down to what is now Mozambique along the coast of southern Africa. Across the Zimbabwean plateau, we find smaller subsidiary settlements that may have functioned as the chief administrative centers for the hegemons ruling at Great Zimbabwe. By the 16th century, the site of Great Zimbabwe was completely abandoned, and the territorial coherence had broken up. There are many possible factors for Zimbabwe's decline. An urban population, along with a changing environment through soil erosion, overgrazing, the loss of nearby trees, trade routes. Trade routes may also have moved, may also have shifted. They could have been lost, along with the exhaustion of nearby gold supplies, gold sources. They're all possible factors for the decline and the eventual fall of Great Zimbabwe. After the fall of Great Zimbabwe, a number of smaller states rise in the area, and these states were known to the later European traders who came into this area, and those who came along were navigating along the east coast of Africa. Now, the successors to Great Zimbabwe continued to be involved in the Indian Ocean trade, albeit to a lesser degree, exporting slaves and ivory. Now, state formation was associated with a number of social and economic changes in Africa, and in particular in Southeast Africa. Evolving agricultural intensification accompanied this. Population growth accompanied this this phenomena. The establishment of both regional and intercontinental growth and trade accompanied these as well. And under these circumstances, well-positioned individuals tapped into new forms of wealth and positioned themselves more in a more hierarchical manner in their society over their contemporaries. And it is at this point we will break. When we come back, we will conclude our lectures, our overviews of African civilization, African history. As always, I'm Ted. Hit like, subscribe, and comment. Let me know what you thought about this lecture. And I will see you guys next time as we conclude our look into African history.